Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's Canadian Foundation for Dietetic Research webinar, Towards Decolonization within Dietetic Practice. I am Tina Stewart, and I'm the co-chair of the CFDR Board of Directors, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. On behalf of the Board of Directors of CFDR, we welcome you today to the second part of our brand new webinar series. As a not-for-profit organization, we do really rely on the support of our partners and individuals such as yourselves to support the important work that we do. We just have a few updates for you. We do have an upcoming research showcase in March. There will be more information coming to the CFDR website in November, where there will be a call for abstracts. We invite you to check out our website, because we have announced the 5 new research grants that we gave funding for this year in 2025. And I also want to let you know that the 2026 grant competition will be opening up next week on October 1st, and dietitians are able to find details under the 4 researchers at CFDR. You can also follow us on a few of our rebranded, refreshed social media outlets, so Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, where we have been highlighting a lot of the upcoming information. And a few housekeeping notes. Please feel free to type questions in the chat box as we go, and we will do our best to address as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation. I am pleased to introduce today's speakers, Dr. Sandra Juutilainen, PhD RD, and Dr. Rhona Hanning, PhD RD. Sandra is a Haudenosaunee Oneida Nation of the Thames and Finnish Canadian. She is an assistant professor of Indigenous Health and Nutrition in the School of Nutrition at Toronto Metropolitan University and holds an adjunct assistant professor appointment in the School of Public Health Sciences at the University of Waterloo. Sandra is a registered dietitian and member of the College of Dietitians of Ontario. Her research interests include Indigenous health and wellness, human rights, critical dietetics, nutrition, food security, sovereignty, qualitative and mixed methods research, and community-driven research informed by Indigenous methodologies. Our second speaker, Rhona Hanning, is a distinguished professor emerita in the School of Public Health Sciences, Faculty of Health, University of Waterloo. She's a fellow of Dietitians of Canada, as well as a fellow of the Canadian Nutrition Society. Rhona has worked with First Nation communities over the past 3 decades on research to support healthy eating for youth and enhance community food systems. Her teaching and research activities have explored decolonizing education and healthcare practices. A longtime supporter of CFDR, Rhona has served on the inaugural board of directors and through subsequent research grant review and various board positions. She is excited to co-present with Dr. Sandra Juutilainen on behalf of the Towards Decolonizing Dietetic Practice team. And without further ado, I will hand it over to Sandra and Rhona.
Okay, great. I just wanted, before we keep moving along here, I just want to recognize the other great women who are on our research team, namely Laura Diaz, our star graduate student, and she's also a dietitian, and Shannon Grant, a PhD RD, Kelly Gordon, a registered dietitian, Hannah Neufeld at the University of Waterloo, PhD, and Lee Risdale, who has a master's in education. She's also an RD. So we all have, all of us as this group have longstanding relationships with one another, and we've made a great team on this very important project. So, moving here.
Okay, well, welcome everyone. Just to give a brief outline, once we've done the territorial acknowledgement, we'll provide some brief background and an overview of the Towards Decolonizing Dietetic Practice project. We're going to then describe what we learned from the Dietetic Educators Survey in terms of what's happening in current practice, or at least practice as of 2022, and then add findings from the scoping review of the literature, interviews with Indigenous leaders on ways to help advance dietetic practice. And finally, we'll end with recommendations from our research.
Okay, so I'll start with the territorial acknowledgement. I acknowledge the land that I have the privilege to be working on here today at Toronto Metropolitan University is on the traditional territory of many nations, including Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. So we do land acknowledgements to affirm the rights and presence of Indigenous communities. Rhona?
Yes, joining from the University of Waterloo, which is on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Attawandaron, and the Anishinaabe peoples. I'm a settler from Scottish and English background, and certainly acknowledge my unearned privilege, but strive to be a good steward of the lands on which I work and play and learn.
Great. Thank you, Rhona. I just want to make sure our volume seems to be cutting in and out, so I want to make sure it's working properly.
Okay, when we began our project, and we were funded in 2020, it was 5 years following the release of the 39 calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. So we began with the question, how can the dietetics profession within Canada integrate the TRCC calls to action and expanding on that, Indigenization, decolonization, cultural safety, and anti-racism into its education competencies, standards of practice, and service provision for Indigenous peoples. Next. And because language matters a lot, we wanted to begin with some definitions, which are from this excellent textbook. So colonialism, of course, means many things, but in the context of academia, it acknowledges the privileging of Western dominant knowledge and the minimizing and discrediting of Indigenous knowledges. So decolonizing then involves undoing colonial influences. You can read on for yourself. Essentially, it involves unlearning and learning. Indigenization, on the other hand, is adding Indigenous elements, so efforts to transform spaces, processes, institutions founded in non-Indigenous cultures to include Indigenous ways of knowing, being, acting, and the persons who practice them. So in the words of one of the leaders that we interviewed, for me, decolonizing means how can we integrate Indigenous people's knowledges, our languages, and our presence through everything we do and have that accepted as equal and whole? Next.
So of the 94 TRC calls to action, the ones that are most relevant to our research project were number 18, to acknowledge that the current state of Aboriginal health in Canada is a direct result of Canadian government policies and implement the healthcare rights of Aboriginal peoples. Number 24, require that all students take a course dealing with Aboriginal health issues, including the history and legacy of residential schools and Indigenous teachings and practices. And number 22, to recognize the value of Aboriginal healing practices and use them in the treatment of Aboriginal patients in collaboration with Aboriginal healers and elders when requested by Aboriginal patients. So we just threw in a quote here by one of our Indigenous leaders who I interviewed. We interviewed 14 of them, and I really love this quote. So because it's so relevant to when the TRC calls to action first came out. People thought, a lot of them were like a tick box kind of thing that you had to just check off and move on in your daily business. So this particular person said, a lot of times the issue is that it becomes a checkbox. Okay, I've done my 22, 24 and check. I've done my cultural history and safety course. I got the module certificate, check. But it's how you practice it and act on it every day. And I feel that sometimes it is missed, especially from an organizational level, right?
So at the time that we began in 2020, the new integrated competencies for dietetic education and practice had just been released. And the performance indicators there are to demonstrate awareness of Indigenous values and ways of knowing related to food environments and also related to health and wellness. to demonstrate awareness of the role of Indigenous traditional country foods in dietary practices, the availability and preparation of Indigenous traditional or country foods, and also awareness of the ongoing impact of colonization, residential schools, intergenerational trauma, and systemic racism on Indigenous peoples in Canada. And even with PDEP having ceased operations about a year ago, many programs are still working and in some cases struggling to achieve these competencies. Okay, so this was a very ambitious project for a $20,000 CFDR grant. It includes several components: a scoping review of the literature, interviews with Indigenous leaders, survey of dietetic education and training programs, and integrated knowledge mobilization throughout. Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time on methodology because we have a lot of results that we want to share with you today, but we will go through them briefly, and we're happy to respond to questions at the end. In terms of the scoping review, this was an English language review. It was updated at the end of 2023. We did the title and abstract reviews in duplicate. We used Covidence software, and we're currently writing this up using Prisma scoping review guidelines.
And I did the qualitative interviews with 14 Indigenous leaders across Canada, and they were identified by members of our team. We used snowball sampling. We did the one-on-one semi-structured interviews. So myself and graduate student Laura Diaz took notes and sat in on all the interviews. They were audio recorded and transcribed. We used deductive and inductive coding, and some of them were coded in duplicate.
Yeah, this survey is essentially the graduate work of Laura Diaz. There were 34 closed and open-ended questions, and these were developed by Laura as well as 2 dietetic interns from the Northern School of Medicine program under the supervision of Lee Risdale and with input from the larger team. The surveys were distributed to the leads of all of the accredited education and training programs using Qualtrics.
And our integrated knowledge mobilization events have included presentations at the Dietitians of Canada conferences in 2021, plus we had a workshop there. We presented again in 2022 and 2024. We presented to educators in 2021 and 2022. And then, of course, we have our end of study publications, which more are to come. As you see an asterisk here from the scoping review and the interviews with Indigenous leaders, we have manuscripts in progress, and we hope to get those done this year. Okay, it's not advancing. Can somebody at CFDR help out with advancing the slides? It's not working on my end. Tina? Oh, there we go. So that took a while to advance that slide. So the publications we have to date, again, Laura Diaz, our graduate student, was the leader of this particular publication and did the heavy lifting for this work. I highly recommend anyone working in dietetics read this publication on Canadian dietetic education and training actions to support indigenization, decolonization, and reconciliation.
Okay, so the scoping review resulted in 76 full text sources, and these are essentially fell into the categories of recruitment of Indigenous students, support or retention of Indigenous students and dietitians and others, decolonizing curriculum, and here we're focused on the process but not the content of curriculum so much, student placements, decolonizing within practice, healthcare practice as relevant to dietetics, and guidance for work with Indigenous peoples. I wanted to make note of this quote from one of the leaders. When I hear evidence-based, I get a little bit of a shiver down my neck and spine, because oftentimes that doesn't include Indigenous peoples. Oftentimes it doesn't value lived experience. It's very clinical. We were very aware of this. This also came out at our first workshop. This is a literature review, but all of the articles were screened for relevance to Indigenous peoples as well as relevance to dietetics. And we also extended from peer review to include things like commentaries, editorials, professional reports. And in doing so, we especially prioritized Indigenous authors or Indigenous perspectives. Thanks.
Again, oh, there we go. Oh, sorry.
So returning to the survey then, we had responses from
Wait,
20.
Rhona, I skipped over a slide, so I don't quite know how to go back here. I really need CFDR's help here in working these slides. It's not working the best on my end. So hold on
If
one
you
second.
get out of presenter view, you should be able to go back a slide. You'll see the one on the interviews.
It's not. Okay, we're just going to have to skip it because I can't get back to it and no one's helping me. So.
Okay, well, Sandra, if you talk to the key informant interviews, did you want to talk to that? That was
No,
the previous
you
slide.
can work on this slide. It's just the slide previous to this. I can't get out of it. I can't get out of this slide right now. Please
Okay, sure. So the
I'm trying
survey
to
then, to carry on.
Yeah, carry on.
We had responses from 20 of 29 programs, so almost 70%, which was great. These were half undergraduate programs, about a quarter post-degree practicum programs, and the remainder combined master's practicum types of programs. As you'll see, most of the respondents were from Central Canada, and the distribution basically mimicked the distribution of programs across the country. Next.
Okay. And again, these slides are not advancing. There we go.
Okay, so to repeat again, as we present the results, what we're going to do is identify what we learned from the survey, additional findings from the scoping review of the literature, and also what the Indigenous leaders told us. Okay, so beginning with recruitment of Indigenous students, about 65% of the dietetic programs did identify mechanisms to attract Indigenous students and interns. 45% prioritized spots. So for example, there were interviews for any of the Indigenous applicants in one institution. Of the programs or the institutions, and if you go to Laura's paper, you get a better breakdown of the data according to what happened at the program level and what happened at the institutional level. But about 40% identified that they had financial support for students, and 45% do outreach in high schools. Now, when we add what we've learned from the literature, in fact, this outreach begins in some cases as early as elementary school. And there are some programs that support high school students with preparation skills to enter health-related studies. So pipeline type of programs, particularly in nursing, and potentially an opportunity for dietetics to partner on. Tailored admission and application scoring processes are common, particularly in medicine, where, for example, there might be priority for applicants that come from northern or remote communities, as is the case in the Northern Ontario School of Medicine, and also designated spots for those who meet the academic admissions criteria. Next.
Yep, I'm trying. It's not working. Oh, there we go. Okay, so the Indigenous leaders. So I had the great privilege of listening and learning from 14 Indigenous leaders on recruitment. And a lot of the main themes were creating dedicated spaces for Indigenous students, having different pathways, engaging youth early, and acknowledging the barriers that youth have to entering studies. So I'm just going to read a few of the quotes here that we chose. There's a need for dedicated spaces for Indigenous applicants, and sometimes that might even involve different pathways to getting there. So, I think dietetics as a whole has been a very rigid profession, and we have our ways of getting into the programs. However, we need to, if we really want to have a commitment to decolonization, we have to create these different pathways to get Indigenous students into these programs. The second quote here, we changed our intake of Indigenous students a bit, and we had to fight for that. We're usually saying what Indigenous leadership roles have you had, but our Indigenous kids don't have those opportunities that mainstream kids have. So inherent things we do as Indigenous peoples are strong leadership roles. So just recognizing different types of roles that could be applicable to leadership. And maybe the reason why there's not enough Indigenous students or not a lot of Indigenous dietitians is, for one, the barrier to move to a new area, the access to the school itself, like tuition and for placement. I know a lot of folks that is such a burden to have to, complete unpaid placements.
Now, of course, once we have Indigenous students recruited, it's really important to support them and to foster their success. And the same would go with Indigenous staff members, dietitians, faculty members. Through the survey, about 60% of the programs or the institutions that house them identified that they facilitated access to Indigenous mentors, and 45% provided support to cultural organizations, communities, and so on. More than 40% had dedicated living or meeting spaces for Indigenous students, and 30% dedicated academic support. And I do want to emphasize here that certainly the Indigenous students do well. This support is geared towards evening the playing field, where some may have not had as many background courses in specific areas, and to helping support different learning styles. In terms of attracting staff and faculty, there's often a lot of prioritized spots, specific calls for Indigenous applicants, and most of the programs facilitate access to cultural supports. From the literature, there too are examples of supporting different learning styles, providing culturally safe spaces and opportunities for Indigenous students to connect with each other. One program developed a mindfulness support program to help Indigenous students with anxiety around the transition to university. Another provided specific approaches for mentors to help them to be successful in working with Indigenous students. Thanks.
Okay. Yep, trying to advance these slides. Okay, so again, going back to the qualitative interviews with Indigenous leaders, what they had to say on support for Indigenous students, staff, and faculty, creating safe spaces, increasing the numbers, and especially in relation to Indigenous staff and faculty, just having that awareness of over-solicitation and calling on Indigenous faculty to, be involved in every TRC initiative at the university. So I'll just read a couple of the quotes. There needs to be more of us, Indigenous faculty, and our ways should be integrated into teaching and learning. So like more storytelling, less like written exams, and having people actually think and talk and practice, even the calls to action for a skill-based training, not just didactic. So, and this is so important, Indigenous faculty members get asked to be involved with things. I think it's out of respect, but people realize that we're overcommitted and over-solicited, and they're aware of that. But we still, want to be involved, of course. And creating safe spaces for people to disclose their identity. There's still too many students who don't even want to share it because it invites racism and misconceptions.
In terms of the curriculum, about 80% of the survey respondents incorporate Indigenous content through courses or coursework at the program or at the institutional level. But the amount of that content is sometimes quite limited and maybe only a guest lecture. Only 31% of the institutions make this coursework mandatory. So 74% did offer guest lectures, 58% one-time events. Increasingly, there are land-based learning opportunities, and in a small percentage, field trips. Here, I did think you might be interested in the topics that were covered if you haven't had a chance to see the paper. We're very good at covering social determinants of health and nutrition inequities. Slightly smaller percentage of programs address historic and ongoing impacts of colonization or traditional Indigenous foods and ways of knowing and doing. Thanks. From the literature, there's a focus on integrating Indigenous cultural reviews on health and healing, and importantly, using strength-based approaches and really celebrating the resilience of Indigenous peoples and communities. And there are so many examples of that. Many integrate Indigenous specific cultural safety, equity, and social justice aspects, and really sitting with the students and having them examine their own biases, unsettling the settler perspectives on anti-Indigenous racism, and really encouraging lots of reflection and reflexivity. There were some interesting examples where Indigenous and non-Indigenous colleagues work together to create cultural communication scenarios, curriculum simulations that could really work well in the learning environment. In other cases, Indigenous leaders were also instrumental in looking at the curriculum as a whole and trying to provide insights and perspectives on where aspects of decolonization and indigenization could be introduced, not just as one course, but integrated throughout the throughout the curriculum. I think it's important to note here, though, that in many cases we do call on our Indigenous colleagues, and as Sandra mentioned, recognize the burden associated with that.
So what the Indigenous leaders said on curriculum was that, of course, we need to center Indigenous voices and ways and have respectful engagement with Indigenous colleagues, take on an anti-racist and anti-oppressive lens. A few of what the leaders said were decolonizing curriculum. The process needs to be led by Indigenous peoples, and recognizing that there is a potential burden, especially because a low number of individuals, like at the university level, and some are in their early stages of careers, but recognizing that tension, though, that we do as Indigenous faculty, we want to be involved. We have a responsibility to this. And another one of the participants said, we now have Indigenous content strewn across 5 major courses and nobody with expertise to teach it. So this is very problematic as well. You have to make sure you have the right people to teach this content. And I really love this quote. Can you imagine if we gave students like a 1-hour guest lecture on diabetes and that's all they got for diabetes for their whole degree? Like, do you really think dietitians would be really good providing care for folks with diabetes? Laughs. Like, absolutely not. So how is one guest lecture of somebody who's Indigenous going to capture or prepare students to work effectively and efficiently in Indigenous communities and with families and patients? So we got a lot of great, can't wait to spend more time with those transcripts and write up that paper because we have so much good information there.
Yeah, in terms of student placements, none of the dietetic programs had placements available for all students, although they were optional in about 60% of programs, mainly as practicum placements, but occasionally as placements within Indigenous organizations. 30% didn't offer practicums at all. Interestingly, those who responded to the specific question, 8 of 13 offered pre-preparation before these placements, and 10 out of 12 had some kind of debriefing opportunity following that. If we look to the literature, we see that that where placements are offered, students invariably find the experiences beneficial, and the words life-changing came up quite often in some of the testimonials about the experiences. Providing dietetic students with Indigenous cultural competency training before they went on placements was certainly considered important within the Australian experience. And finally, the placements are especially important. Realistically, we probably don't have the capacity to offer placements for all students, and nor would that be beneficial to communities. But for students who go on to practice in Indigenous communities, they do comment on how important that opportunity was for them.
Yeah.
Okay.
And this is echoed in the Indigenous leaders' comments on placements, and that they have to be community driven. They really have to benefit the communities. And the students who do have access to these placements, recommend them. They have great hands-on experience, but there needs to be adequate preparation before going into communities. So some of the words of what our Indigenous leaders said is engagement is all good and fine, but if it's not driven by community, if it's not a dynamic conversation from start, middle, second middle to end, it's not going to work. So it's like not having that, okay, we're the university and we want to come into your community and bring all our students. Like there has to be some reciprocity and benefit for the communities. So we have placements. Another quote is, we have our placements up north in northern communities and reserves in that, and that's important. That's absolutely important. But very unfortunately and dangerously is what I would say is how ill prepared we go up to these communities. And I've seen that in practice as well. And just hearing other university presentations on how they prepare their students for going up to communities. The last quote here is, they spend a week there in a remote First Nation, they immerse in the community, and when they're not reading about it, where they're not kind of watching a video about it, but they're actually there and they're actually meeting the elders and they're actually hands-on. They're spending time with the people on the reserve, and that's been really significant. It really changes their whole outlook. So those opportunities are great when we can do them in the right way.
In terms of decolonizing practice, 10% of the surveyed programs or the institutions identified mandatory cultural safety and or anti-racism training for staff or faculty. And I found that sort of boggled my mind that it was only 10%, although 60% of them have non-mandatory training. And this was the words that are covered up mainly as webinars, and indeed many, the larger sort of piece of the pie, the blue 65% of that was webinars. And you'll notice that I have my my orange shirt on in advance of the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation next Tuesday. From the literature, there were some pretty interesting examples. Cultural immersion opportunities for healthcare practitioners, including dietitians, cultural immersion camps. Communities of practice were considered really valuable. And by this, not so much the networks like in kin, although they're wonderful, but opportunities for groups of dietitians who are practicing in common areas to get together and share some of their experiences. Certainly, I've found that really invaluable in some of my community-based research, where we're working with different communities, and the research coordinators can share some of their experiences. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the term two-eyed seeing. This was one that came from the Albert Marshall, a Mi'kmaq elder, and implies seeing with one eye from a Western perspective, seeing from another eye with an Indigenous perspective. Essentially, what it's saying is when you go into collaborations that you're confident in who you are and what you bring to the table and you're open, this relationship piece becomes so important, open to the different perspectives of those with whom you're collaborating with. There are lots of examples of care models, for example, within healthcare settings that are culturally based and different strategies. So this could be something like education materials, community delivered cares. For example, in some cases, there are patient advocates who are Indigenous, socio-cultural strategies like making ceremony available, and translation. And so integrating Indigenous peoples within those strategies. And it was also mentioned that sometimes you need to consider people of different ages, given the different target groups for example, our education efforts. And then finally, the specific cultural safety training was considered important, but also accountability. So if there are new staff who come into an organization, that they too have the benefit of that training. Thanks.
Yep. So what our Indigenous leaders told us on decolonizing practice is all about changing perspectives and viewing life through a holistic lens, having a dialogue, recognizing that it's a reflective journey. Dietetics practice is all about, we teach our students how dietetics practice is really rooted in reflection and how we can do better going forward. So I'll just read the middle quote first because I was speaking about dietitians in general. So there are some dietitians that are meeting together even just to reflect, and I've been able to participate in a couple of those sessions where we're having some really frank conversations, and a growing number of people everyone's at a different level in their journey, but at least we're going through and actually looking at maybe what changes could be made at the organizational level and what can be made at the individual level. I love this one because I grew up in charting with saying things like non-compliant. So this quote here, be sensitive and appropriate and respectful in terms of your dialogue and what you're charting. Let's do away with the words like non-compliant. And this last quote here, we have a committee that's working on Indigenous initiative strategy out of the main strategy. And I've worked with a student team to do a small research project on what does decolonizing look from the student's perspective. So really, our students are leading the way. Oftentimes, they're way ahead of us in terms of ideas and solutions. So we really need to tap into them as well and to understand what they think decolonizing means from their perspectives, because they're the ones that are receiving the education and training.
Okay, we looked to relevant guidance for working with Indigenous patients, clients, and communities, hear from the literature. And in this area in particular, we were really centering Indigenous authors and Indigenous perspectives. So the guidance falls into several areas: respect, commitment to relationship building, ensuring culturally safe practice in terms of the approach, the skills, the self-awareness of practitioners, emphasizing reciprocity, reflection, as we've heard, and advocacy. And so I won't go through all of the details, but if we look to respect, this included respect for traditional knowledges and beliefs, and importantly, considering where the patient or community is at, what are their needs or priorities, which may be different than the practitioners. Consider the context. So are the foods you may be recommending, are they available? Are they affordable? Are they appropriate? What is happening in the individual's lives? So are they able to act on the kind of advice you might want to put forward? And also, and this is absolutely critical, to consider the diversity within and among Indigenous communities and peoples, because it's certainly not one size fits all. I wanted to emphasize just a couple of the other points. One is relinquish control, because I think that's so difficult, but so very important for all of us. And for any of the administrators who might happen to be online, the final point under reciprocity is an important one. Create mechanisms for people to express their needs and to complain, right? If we don't ask, we may not know what's not working and what we have the potential to improve. So, thanks.
Okay. And our Indigenous leaders on working with Indigenous peoples and communities. Again, respect is a key word here, and as compensating communities, supporting communities, not just coming in and expecting placements for students, building strong relationships, taking small steps, starting as an individual. So I think I'm just going to have to pick one of these great quotes here. So I'm going to focus on relationships because that's really important when working with communities. Being strong in those relationships. Again, that's what the 2-row is all about. So the 2-row wampum, I don't have time to go into that, but you can look that up and find out about what it means in regards to relationships. It's just about a way of building respectful relationships between two parties. If you can't build those strong relationships, then those opportunities can go out the window, because we have to be understanding with each other. We have to know where each other is coming from, and we really meet each other where we're at. So I'll leave it at that and you'll have a copy of these slides so you can read some of these quotes in our upcoming paper. But again, just having the respect for the communities and taking the time to build the relationships. So that's really counter to what how we operate in academia. Everything needs to be done quickly, and we don't focus so much on building those really strong relationships, and that means like knowing people for a very long time. So some of the relationships that came out, and we really these were geared. This was from the survey, so looking at what are the recommendations for dietetic leadership in Canada. So speaking directly to Dietitians of Canada and all of our regulatory bodies across Canada. So what the people who completed the survey said were offer resources to support professional development, webinars, support a community of practice network, offer guidance how to integrate indigenization, decolonization, and reconciliation into the curriculum, and create indicators to measure progress and success, incorporate actions to support indigenization, decolonization, and reconciliation in the dietetic program's accreditation process, lead by example, so diversifying the membership in these organizations, incorporate indigenization, decolonization, and reconciliation in the provincial body's professional practice requirements. So our annual renewal process, which is coming up in October, really build that into there. Like, what have you been doing in the area of decolonization within your own practice? That could be one of the questions that people answer, and within the quality assurance program as well. Require non-Canadian professionals seeking to enter dietetic practice in Canada to complete training focused on Indigenous peoples, as done in New Zealand. So, and then just a final word on some more from one of our Indigenous leaders. So the calls to action, the 94 calls to action have a wide scope, right? It's all of Canadian society. So take time to understand the complexity. It's going to take time and small steps, but small meaningful steps. So really it's not just the leaders of our profession, it's also individuals that can take action. And we hope that what you've learned today here will help with that in the papers that we already released and the ones that are forthcoming. And Yonko, thank you for your attention today. And just a reminder that yes, next week on September 30th is our National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. So yes, you can learn some new Indigenous words here. So this is We Care for Our Children in Oneida language. I'm not speaking Oneida all the time, so it takes me a little bit, but it's really important. So that's a way to decolonize, is learning Indigenous languages in this country, which were the original languages before settlers came to our lands. So thank you very much for your attention. Rhona, do you have any final words?
No, thanks for your attention. We really wanted to reserve time to hear from you and to be able to respond to your questions. So I'm delighted that we barreled through. We were a bit worried and that we managed to achieve, 15 minutes so that we can take your questions, and looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Okay, so am I just going through the chat here? Because can you see this on your end, Tina, or not?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yes, I can see it. So if
Okay,
you're cool, I can just kind of ask the questions and scroll through.
sure.
You
Yeah.
guys can just
Okay,
Yeah,
great.
and we
relax
can,
and answer. Yes.
yeah.
So I have a comment, says question from Jackie. I can't see her whole name, but she said, this is such great information. Have you considered sharing the results with other health professions? Some of the information would be transferable, and Indigenous people will benefit if dietitians support our colleagues.
Yeah, so that was one of the one of the Indigenous leaders I interviewed was from nursing. And she really recommended that, we need to, as health professionals, we need to be working together on these initiatives. We can't have a silo approach, and it'll be more effective if we work together. So definitely that would be something to do going forward.
Great, thank you. Now, Rhona answered this question, but there was so I'm going to restate it because not everyone was able to see the chat. So there was a question about confusion about the placement side. None offered. Does that mean no Indigenous-led agencies have a spot, or no one has dedicated Indigenous spots? Can you clarify, please?
Yeah, so the survey was actually a survey of the dietetic education and training programs. So the answers are from the perspective of the program. So about 30% of them identified that they didn't actually offer placements. Now, some of the respondents were, of course, undergrad education programs, and one would oftentimes placements are more a part of our practicum or postgraduate type of training opportunities. But I think the important point that also came out with the comments is that relationships here are very important, right? That for a program to, they develop relationships with specific communities or organizations, and then, can create an environment that's reciprocal so that the students benefit, but also the organization can benefit from the engagement of the students there as well. And so it's not surprising that not every organization would offer practicums because it takes time to develop those kinds of relationships.
Great, thank you, Rhona, for that explanation. We have another question. Is a more formalized two-eyed seeing approach in the works anywhere for university-based nutrition programs? Western University has an excellent climate change course built this way with Indigenous ways of knowing, presented along with Western science knowledge, called Connecting for Climate Change Action. It could be a wonderful example to follow, and nutrition is such a perfect topic for this two-eyed seeing approach.
Yeah. If I can jump in here, Sandra, and I'm
Sure,
sure
go
you have
ahead.
lots to add as well.
Yeah.
I think that there is, as you say, lots of potential. Interestingly enough, with my research, one of the community members and project I was doing in British Columbia said, well, two-eyed seeing, that's sort of from Eastern Canada. That's where the term came from. But I think and pointed out the Haida totem on the UBC campus, where if you look at the totem pole at the top, you've got a longboat and a canoe traveling alongside, which symbolizes the same sort of type of working together in the same direction, different, but in the same direction. And the two-row wampum, that Sandra referred to, again, similar kinds of concepts to that whole two-eyed seeing. I taught a course at University of Waterloo with an Indigenous elder, and it was just a wonderful experience because, we really tried to use decolonizing approaches that the students could reflect their learning journey throughout the course using a range of different approaches, which who knew that health students were so incredibly creative, whether it was fine art or poetry, or different kinds of ways that they used to represent their learning. So yes, I think there's immense opportunities to do so, probably only limited by the number of Indigenous colleagues and so on that we can work on these kinds of approach together with.
Yeah, and want to build on that. So some of the responses from the Indigenous leaders were that, we really need to have time and space as, nutrition professionals to get together and share the best practices that we are doing, because I think that's really important. So I don't think we can answer that question fully, and it's going to be something that we need to spend more time on and share resources that we have across the country.
Yeah, and Kelly Gordon just identified within the chat, and it's absolutely true. Within dietetics, the program through Nourish Leadership, Food is Our Medicine, is fantastic. There are programs that suggest that it be available or make it available to all students, and it really is a wonderful program. So that's kind of highly recommended, whether it's for your own personal learning journey or something that you can involve groups of learners with as well.
Thanks. And on that note, Rhona, there has been some great sharing within the chats. People have been sharing some resources as well. So hopefully when people get access to the recording, they will be able to access some of those if you also want to download them right now. I do have another question. Indigenous faculty is overwhelmed with the responsibility to provide cultural safety training in institutions. Do you think non-Indigenous faculty can share that responsibility in a certain way?
Yeah, if they have the education to, and if they've taken their own training, and if they've spent a lot of time in kind of anti-racist, anti-oppressive training, I believe they can do that as well, and they should share the responsibility. It shouldn't solely be on Indigenous faculty, but the people have to be properly trained. That's the only thing.
Yeah.
And people really want to stay away from those topics too. They're we all have PhDs, and people will say, oh, well, I don't know anything about that topic. Well, part of having a PhD is you're able to learn quickly and be able to, put that information forward. So I think people just have to take a responsibility to, it's all Canadian responsibility to work on these issues. So I think it's just taking up that responsibility and taking the time to learn. And yes, we live in this fast-paced society where everyone's overburdened with their workloads, but this is an important issue for Canada.
I think that, settlers are oftentimes really hesitant, because of this sort of acknowledgement, of our own backgrounds and limitations there. But there are many, many great resources that are developed by Indigenous peoples that are available. And, Nourish is certainly one that we've highlighted. There's the Sanyas training program that's superb. The course through University of Alberta, the free course through Coursera, which covers a lot of elements of Indigenous history, is one that's free and also, maybe of interest to folks, and lots of different materials. And so in some ways, people can sort of, tap on those to get a more authentic voice and to integrate it into the teaching and the different programs that they're responsible for.
Actually, Tina, I'm just going to cut in because I saw a really good question in the chat here that I want to respond to. Oh, no, it's moving around too fast. Okay. Here's a really good question. Is there a risk that having reserved spots and somewhat altered entrance requirements for Indigenous students might perpetuate racism and division among dietetic students? And how might we mitigate that? So I think how we mitigate that is when really everyone is on the same page in regards to Indigenous history in Canada, because it hasn't been taught in our schools, then that's going to remedy that situation, because people are going to know that Indigenous students haven't had the same privileges as non-Indigenous students. So there, and then we really have to get away with racism for one, and that's going to help with that too. So yeah, it's the whole dialogue and narrative around Indigenous history in Canada. And once we tackle that, then we won't have these issues anymore. But we have to, we really have to, I think it's the responsibility of everyone, the leadership of nutrition programs really have to be explicit at not just saying, when we hear like, oh, marginalized groups or equity deserving groups, well, don't just say those words, say why, And I think, having our National Day of Truth and Reconciliation now in place, that Canadians are really getting educated on the history of Indigenous peoples in Canada. So that's my answer to that question.
Yeah, and I think for most programs that have designated spaces, those are designated spaces for people who meet a certain level of certain criteria. And so that I think, that has to be acknowledged too. I know one of the papers I read, which was from dentistry from University of Saskatchewan, talked about how they had some reserved spots, but there were also Indigenous students in the non-reserved spots, and nobody knew who got in by what mechanism, in the end of the day. So I think that it's important to be mindful, absolutely, but I think there are ways of doing it that can hopefully avoid that kind of stigmatism.
Thank you so much. That was a great answer to a difficult question. So thanks for asking it, and thanks for your very thoughtful response. There is another one that you may have seen in the chat, and somebody did actually provide some resources, but there was a question saying, or as a settler, I'm on a learning journey to become a better ally. I would be open to sharing the load of creating cultural safety. Are there any pathways available to start that work? And some people have actually put some references and suggestions in the chat, but I'm wondering if you guys have anything that you might want to add to that.
Oh, I'm not able to see all the
okay.
all the resources here. Yeah, we could provide some resources after, and that's the thing. There are a lot of good resources out there. You don't have to start from scratch or recreate the wheel. It's just it's finding the appropriate resources, and then really, I think for allies, coming at it from their perspective. Honestly, I think if an ally is teaching something about cultural safety, and they can come from their settler perspective and what they've learned within those cultural safety trainings, and how their perspective has changed.
Yeah. And in fact, Kelly's just identified in the chat too that, or at least Diane did, that there is an upcoming future building opportunity in October, a workshop that people can attend. So that may be of interest as well.
Thank you. I don't think we have any more questions, and we actually have 3 more minutes left.
Okay.
I think so. First of all, I want to say thank you so much. This was such an important topic, and I know this is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of your research, but thank you for sharing. This was great. Lots of very positive positive remarks in the chat. I think what I'm going to do is we will be sending out the slides. I do have a link to the research article you referenced, but I'm also going to collate all of the resources that people have shared so we can send it out broadly to the attendees and that they have that. And if you guys have anything you want to add to it. So we'll get that out in the next week or so. But thank you so much. This was an absolutely fantastic talk. Amazing. Thank you.
Thank you, Tina, for coordinating.
Thanks. Yeah.
Okay, it's 12:58. We have 2 minutes left. Amazing.
Yeah.
Have a great afternoon, everybody, and thank you for coming.
Okay. Thanks.
Yep. Thank you. Bye.